The former U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, has recently made a very controversial claim, putting the entire blame of Gaza's food shortage on Hamas. This statement has triggered strong reactions, debates, and raised many questions about the real causes of the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. To understand what is actually happening, we need to look deeper at the context, the politics, the blockades, and the lived reality of people inside Gaza. Because while leaders argue and point fingers, it is ordinary families, children, and vulnerable communities that face the consequences of hunger and deprivation. Friedman's statement is bold, but is it accurate? He suggests that Hamas, by its decisions and governance, is solely responsible for the lack of food in Gaza. According to him, Israel is not the main factor behind this crisis, but rather Hamas mismanagement and actions. This is where we need to pause and carefully examine the situation. Gaza is a tiny strip of land, home to more than 2 million people, one of the most densely populated places in the world. Since 2007, after Hamas took control of Gaza, Israel has imposed a blockade on the territory. This blockade restricts the movement of goods, food supplies, medicines, fuel, and even basic humanitarian aid. It is impossible to understand Gaza's hunger crisis without recognizing this blockade as a central reality. When Friedman blames Hamas entirely, many see this as a deflection away from Israel's responsibility. The truth is far more complex. Hamas does govern Gaza, and there are issues with corruption, internal mismanagement, and prioritization of military expenditures over civilian needs. But at the same time, international organizations, human rights groups, and aid agencies have repeatedly documented how the blockade and repeated military strikes destroy infrastructure, farmlands, fishing zones, and the ability of Gaza to be self-sufficient. The population is heavily dependent on aid, and when crossings are closed, food shortages become severe. So to say Hamas is solely responsible ignores the wider structural and political realities. For many Muslims around the world, statements like Friedman A.S. feel like attempts to demonize an entire population by focusing on Hamas while ignoring the suffering of ordinary Palestinians. Families in Gaza, mothers who wait in line for bread, children who go to bed hungry, elderly people with no access to medicine. They are not responsible for political decisions. They are caught in a system designed to keep them vulnerable. When leaders point fingers without addressing the humanitarian dimension, the truth gets overshadowed by propaganda. Let's also remember that food security in Gaza is not simply about Hamas or Israel. It is also shaped by international aid politics, border controls with Egypt, and the overall neglect of Palestinian rights in international law. For example, Gaza has farmland, but Israeli restrictions on imports like fertilizers, machinery, and even seeds make farming extremely difficult. Fishermen in Gaza are often prevented from going beyond limited nautical miles, crippling one of the main sources of local food. Add to this the frequent bombings that destroy bakeries, markets, and food storage facilities, and the crisis worsens. So while Hamas may share some responsibility in governance, placing the entire blame on them is misleading. From a technical standpoint, the United Nations has categorized Gaza as being on the brink of famine conditions in certain areas. Malnutrition is rising, clean water is scarce, and more than half the population faces food insecurity. Humanitarian agencies repeatedly call for unhindered access to deliver aid. Yet every time aid trucks are delayed, stopped, or destroyed in cross-border violence, civilians are the ones who pay the price. These realities do not match Friedman's simplified narrative. Instead, they reveal a multifaceted crisis driven by both internal and external factors. Politically, Friedman's words serve another purpose. By blaming Hamas entirely, he strengthens the Israeli government's position that its policies are justified and that Palestinians should turn against Hamas. This argument attempts to shift international pressure away from Israel and put all eyes on Gaza, leadership. But many analysts argue that this oversimplification not only ignores Israel's role, but also blocks real solutions. You cannot solve a food crisis by blaming one side and ignoring the impact of siege, war, and occupation. Solutions require opening crossings, lifting restrictions, and ensuring humanitarian supplies reach those who need them most. Another point that needs to be understood is how narratives shape perception. When a high-profile figure like Friedman speaks, his words are amplified in international media. Viewers who are not familiar with the complex realities may accept the claim at face value. They might believe that if Gaza is hungry, it is because Hamas chooses it to be that way. But if we dig deeper, we see that the hunger crisis is a result of systematic deprivation, lack of freedom of movement, restricted trade, and cycles of conflict. In short, Gaza's hunger is manufactured, not accidental. For Muslims across the globe, hearing such claims highlights once again how Palestinian suffering is often politicized. Instead of focusing on the humanitarian duty to feed the hungry and care for the oppressed, the conversation becomes about assigning blame. Islamic values teach that feeding the hungry is an obligation, regardless of politics. So when Muslims see the people of Gaza deprived of basic food, it resonates as a deeply unjust situation that cannot simply be explained by saying Hamas is at fault. Instead, it calls for solidarity, charity, and advocacy for the rights of Palestinians. The reality on the ground in Gaza shows resilience despite hardship. Families share what little they have, neighbors support each other, and aid organizations do everything possible under immense constraints. Yet, this resilience should not be romanticized because no community should have to live under such constant struggle for survival. The blockade and ongoing violence create a cycle where every new escalation pushes Gaza deeper into crisis. Without addressing these structural issues, simply blaming Hamas will not bring bread to the tables of hungry children. Looking at the bigger picture, one must ask, why would Friedman make such a claim now? Part of it may be tied to the ongoing global debate on Israel and Palestine, where pro-Israel voices attempt to justify military actions and blockades by highlighting Hamas's role as a governing authority. By blaming Hamas for everything, they absolve Israel of responsibility. But history tells us that responsibility in this conflict is shared. Hamas, Israel, regional powers, and the international community all play a role in the suffering or relief of Gaza. When we strip away the politics, one truth remains clear. No child deserves to go hungry. No family deserves to live in a situation where food becomes a weapon. Gaza's food crisis is not just about mismanagement. It is about decades of policies designed to weaken a population and strip them of dignity. Muslims around the world understand this through the lens of justice and compassion, recognizing that the people of Gaza deserve more than accusations. They deserve freedom, security, and sustenance. That is why it is so important to question narratives like Friedman's. Blaming Hamas may sound convenient in headlines, but it distracts from the deeper realities. It is essential to bring forward the voices of those who live through this crisis daily, who can testify that hunger comes not only from political leadership, but also from sieges, blockades, and bombings that destroy the very foundations of life.